Good evening, and thank you for joining us for our program today. My name is Gavin Kleespies, and I am the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. I would like to extend a special welcome to anyone who might be attending a virtual MHS program for the first time. Considering the size of our virtual crowd and the geographic diversity of the people who signed up, I'm sure there are some people who are interacting with MHS for the first time. If you are not familiar with MHS, we are the oldest historical society in America. We were founded in 1791 and have been an independent, nonprofit institution dedicated to collecting, preserving, publishing, and sharing our nation and our state's history for the past 229 years. In these days of social distancing, we have taken to hosting virtual events, and we have online events planned for every week through July. Our program this evening will look at the new book, The Lost Tradition of Economic Equality in America, 1600 to 1870. We are joined by the author, Daniel Mandel, and he will be in conversation with Liz Covart. At this moment in time, when the United States has some of the highest levels of both wealth and income inequality, this book offers an interesting perspective on how we got here. Although many Americans are concerned about the growing inequality, many continue to believe that the country was founded on a person's right to acquire and control property. Professor Mandel argues in this book that in fact the United States was originally deeply influenced by the belief that maintaining a rough or relative equality of wealth was essential for the cultivation of a successful Republican government. Professor Mandel has used material from this book, specifically from chapter 3, to write a commentary for the Washington Post, as well as material from chapter 9 for A Piece in Time. Daniel Mandel is a professor of history at Truman State University. He received his doctorate and master's degree in history from the University of Virginia. He also received a master's degree in urban and environmental policy from Tufts University and a bachelor's degree in history from Humboldt State University. He will be in conversation with Liz Covart from the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and the podcast Ben Franklin's World. Liz is a historian of early America who practices scholarly history, public history, and digital humanities. She received her PhD and master's from the University of California, Davis, and her BA from Pennsylvania State University. I would like to welcome Liz and Daniel to come to our program. Hello, Liz.
Hello, Gavin. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Thanks for coming, and good to see you, Professor Mandel.
Hello, Gavin. Hello, Liz.
So, Dan, we're here to talk about your new book, The Lost Tradition of Economic Equality in America, 1600 to 1870.
It's great. Good to be here.
Now, I wonder if we could start with Native Americans. Because one of the big themes, it seemed to me when I read your book, The Lost Tradition of Economic Equality in America, was that Native Americans really influenced not only this project itself, but also early American ideas about economic equality. So could you tell us how Native Americans gave birth to this project and to early American ideas about economic equality?
Sure, Liz. Well, as you noted, this project really began with my work on the experience of Native Americans in southern New England. I've always been particularly interested in the connections as well as the distinctions between Native peoples and their neighbors, which by the 19th century meant matters of class as well as race. And about 2004, as I wrote in the introduction, this is the only point where I'll actually read something from the book, but I'll give you a small taste. I began this study while finishing an earlier book on Native Americans in southern New England from the Revolution through Reconstruction, in which, among other things, I delved deeply into economic concerns. The widening gulf between rich and poor in the United States was becoming a major public concern, decried in a growing number of policy studies and articles in national publications. Few, however, considered the history of the issue, and those that did, at best, went back to the Gilded Age, for what the writers assumed was the origin of concerns over economic inequality in America. Now, such ignorance was unfortunate, as I knew from that past research that during the Revolution and for decades afterwards, Americans believed that widespread property ownership was essential to Republican government, and they worried about the corrupting influence of concentrated wealth. Yet I also knew that Congress during Reconstruction had rejected egalitarian land reforms while extending the vote to freedmen, which seemed to mark a substantial ideological shift. My research into how and why that shift occurred led to this book. Now, when I got started on this, I also knew from the start, from past research, that I'd need to dig into two extremely relevant elements that related to Native Americans. First, literally beginning with Columbus, indigenous Americans became for Europeans the living example of an egalitarian people with an egalitarian society. Europeans already had this long-standing tradition of a mythical wild man, sort of a Bigfoot character, who lived in dangerous wastelands between villages and towns, wearing animal skins, lacking refinement and lacking a civilized hierarchy. Some accounts of Indians echoed the dark side of that trope, savage, irrational cannibalism. But others essentially criticized their own contemporary European societies by praising Indians as egalitarian innocents who shared everything. That Edenic view going back to the notion of the Garden of Eden, with Indians being sort of the Adam and Eve in the garden, became particularly prominent during the Enlightenment, as political philosophers from John Locke to Jean-Jacques Rousseau tried to figure out the origins of government, and decided, as Locke wrote, that in the beginning all the world was America, where private property simply did not exist. That was also at about the same time when Native Americans in growing numbers and in delegations began to visit England and Europe, with their appearance and supposed virtues lavishly described in widely circulated newspapers and periodicals. And occasionally some of those visitors were even quoted as being astounded at their hosts' terrible extremes of poverty and wealth, which made me kind of wonder about the subversive effect, if not purpose, of these published accounts. Now, I hope to find that some Anglo-Americans during this period similarly embraced this Edenic view of Native equality. Alas, I did not. Although occasionally groups of colonists, later New Yorkers, would adopt the costume and the pretense of Indians as wild men when using force to resist legal claims by landlords to land where they had squatted, ironically often taken from natives. This brings up the other critical view, the other critical role, rather, of Native Americans. That is, their vast lands and resources taken by Euro-Americans allowed the British American colonists to become, for Europeans, the most equal civilized society on Earth. Some recent studies by economists actually kind of confirm that this was really the case, that in reality, even if you look and include enslaved peoples, the gap between rich and poor was narrower in the colonies in the 18th century than elsewhere in Europe, which meant that since in England the right to vote, to participate, and have a political voice rested on property ownership, that right was far more widespread in England's American colonies than back in the mother country. And that here in America, one could experience the reality of a democratic republic, if you were white, of course. Then, after the War for Independence, native lands continued to serve as a safety valve for the nation, and the idea of economic equality remained embedded in the workings of American democratic republican policy. So there is this deep irony in our history that indigenous Americans became, for Enlightenment writers, symbols of equality, while Euro-Americans approached a rough economic equality largely by taking their land and resources.
It is really fascinating that a lot of these ideas of economic equality came from Native Americans, in terms of Native Americans noticing that people in Europe didn't really have this sense of equality that they had back in North America, and as the way that early Americans viewed them, not necessarily as an equal society, but as bringers of equal society, if only they could be parted from their land. Were Native Americans the only source of ideas for early American ideas about economic equality?
Well, probably my greatest surprise in the study was that the American ideal of economic equality, the idea that concentrated wealth was a threat to the republic, actually originated in 17th century England. Ironically, this egalitarian ideology that wealth as well as political power should be widespread had its roots in the medieval assumption in kind of the opposite, that all forms of power were concentrated. For centuries, that idea had been used to justify autocratic authority, that people, men who had wealth should also have all the political power as well, and that that's the way a hierarchical society went, and that authority came from God all the way down to human beings, and that was necessary, a fundamental structure for society, civilized society. However, this notion of a godly hierarchy was undermined by the Renaissance and challenged by, during the 16th century, by a strain of Protestantism that insisted that the unitary nature of God's creation made hierarchy sinful. At about the same time, Dutch and English Protestants also rediscovered the Jewish tradition as they were translating old copies of the Talmud, of the Jubilee, the great Sabbath held every half century. There's a piece of it in Deuteronomy. All debts were canceled, all slaves freed, and all land returned to its original owners. So this is forming the kind of a tide of radicalism that explodes into prominence during England's Civil War in the 1640s, beginning with the Levelers, a group of London intellectuals and artisans who gained sway among Parliament's new model army during the English Civil War, and then in a more radical form by the True Levelers, as they called themselves, diggers as others called them, who set up communes and condemned private landholding as literally original sin. They pointed to Genesis and said, this is why we were kicked out of Eden, because people started wanting private property and owning it. So they created these communes where they would share everything equally. Of course, the diggers were quickly squashed. Leveler became an epithet, which actually gets repeated and used in the 18th, 19th. I've even seen it in the 20th century. But this egalitarian vision survived in England and in the American colonies. In some ways, the most fascinating source was James Harrington's Commonwealth of Oceania, a novel published in 1656 between the time of the English Civil War and the restoration of 1660. James Harrington, in this novel, reflected on Roman history, Roman agrarian ideas, and wrote about he envisioned a republic, a prosperous republic, grounded on a constitution that gave land to all and placed the limit of wealth, 2,000 pounds a year, I believe, of wealth generated by the land that an individual could own. If one owned any more than that, one had to give it back to the government, who would then redistribute it to others who weren't quite so fortunate. 3 decades later, John Locke's 2 treatises of government argued, like the Levelers, that, quote, all men by nature are equal, and argued that government rested on a voluntary contract among men, and that it was labor that gave value to land, not one's titled nobility or right through that sort of thing. So that those who worked the land had the best right to it. And that's a fundamentally egalitarian argument. Both Harrington and Locke in turn shaped the ideas of the English radical Whigs in the 1720s. Their publications, collectively known as Cato's Letters, condemned the increasingly prominent role of wealth in British politics and called for various political and social reforms. Now, all of those sources would be hugely influential among literate Americans from the 1760s through the end of the 18th century. In fact, that conservative revolutionary John Adams would point to Harrington's book when emphasizing that property and power were interwoven. And in fact, if you go to archive.org and you look for Oceana, Harrington's Oceana. At least one of the copies on archive.org is John Adams' copy from the Boston Public Library's collection of John Adams' library. And he actually signed the inside leaf of it, which is really, really cool. His cousin Sam Adams published in the late 1740s a newspaper for artisans and laborers that quoted from Cato's letters. A number of they're like over several weeks published selections from Cato's letters. And one of them I quoted in the book on the notion that the community needed to redistribute property when a few men gained too much wealth. Even this notion of the Great Sabbath, that every 50 years all property should go back to the original owners, would occasionally be mentioned or talked about in early America into the early Republic. For example, in 1787, a Connecticut assemblyman told his fellow assembly members that this would be a great thing to put into the country's, the state's laws as the best way to avoid oppressive extremes. And at the start of Reconstruction, rumors spread throughout the freedmen community, communities in the South, that the United States President, Lincoln, would order the Jubilee not only with freedom for all who had been held as slaves, but also ownership of the land that they had worked for generations with no rewards. And I could go into some details, maybe I might later on, but there's this continuing influence of English, Scottish, and Irish radicals into the mid-19th century, continuing to bring English ideas to the United States. The Chartists, the labor radicals, and so on, play a very significant role. Socialism, Robert Owen, with his ideas of creating socialist utopias for workers and factories, he literally brought them to the United States in the early 19th century. There was the other side, however, got to emphasize, and that is the idea also comes from England and is embraced by many Americans in the first half of the 19th century, that a society needs stability and the wealthy deserve to have their authority and their power recognized. And I have a chapter in the book about children's literature and how much of the children's literature that's printed in America by American publishers through 1820, 1830, a lot of that's being written by English writers for the children of gentry, for the children of laborers, and they emphasize the need for stability and the need to recognize and privilege wealth and to accept the station that one is born into, which I'm not sure the American revolutionaries would quite have understood or accepted. And then there's also the increasingly extreme laissez-faire ideology that comes from David Ricardo and Thomas Malthus, who argued that it was inevitable that workers, laborers would become poorer and the wealthy would become richer. And a number of American writers, intellectuals embraced that idea by the mid-19th century. So England and Great Britain is a source of ideas for the United States, both sides of equality.
Yeah, it really does sound like early Americans got so many of their ideas from Great Britain and Ireland and Europe in general. And I'm curious because we see this in early America that colonists come over and they come over with all these great English ideas and then they adapt them to their own environments and their own circumstances. And I wonder if you could tell us how Americans took these English and Irish and Scottish ideas and adapted them to suit their own purposes in North America.
As I was outlining, there is this tension that develops starts out during the early Republic and then really becomes significant in the early 19th century. This tension between the idea of the need for stability, the need for some kind of social hierarchy and power in the United States, even in a republic. And that exists in tension for a number of decades between that and the idea that develops during the War for Independence, that there are these ideals about democratic republic, about equality written into the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and that all men should be able to vote and participate in politics and have this natural right to life, liberty, and property. And those two ideas are in tension. And increasingly between 1780 and the early 19th century, you see the shift in American paradigms shifting towards the embrace of stability, the embrace of hierarchy. But there's always tension, there's always conflict. It's not that the idea of egalitarian economics, the idea that everyone should have access to property of some sort dies. It's just that there is this shift in how people, which side dominates this debate. There are a lot of developments in the American economy, the American politics, of course, that shape this debate. One of the more interesting ones that I found during the American Revolution is that there is the increasing importance of capital as a source of wealth as opposed to land. Now, before 1775, everyone thought in terms of land when they contemplated wealth and therefore power. And that's the old European tradition going back to medieval times. And of course, during the colonial period, Americans didn't have much specie, right? They didn't have much capital. They produced goods, they produced crops that were then sold to England, and there's a lot of book debt, and so they lacked capital. During the American Revolution, states and the national government looked to fund the war by issuing promissory notes, and that created a market for capital investment and speculation for the very first time. And so the very first time during the war, Americans had to think about the wealth, about capital and speculation in capital as a source of power, as a source of wealth. And Americans were concerned about this. You see this during the American Revolution. During the war itself, some writers in newspapers pointed to this speculation in war debt as a threat, warning that a few wealthy bankers, merchants, farmers would buy up this debt at a few pennies on the dollar, and then later on demand that taxpayers, i.e. your average farmer, your average artisan and shopkeeper, would have to pay back the full value to those who already held all this wealth. And that's actually indeed what happened in the 1780s. That's why we had things called the agrarian uprisings, the best known one being Shays' Rebellion. So that is one of the things that begins to shape how these older ideas from England get reworked by Americans based on the circumstances that they face during the Revolutionary War. Then after the Revolutionary War, of course, there are all the concerns about establishing a nation that is very weak in the world that's at war. European nations expected this experiment in democratic republic ideals to fall apart any minute. And so a noticeable number of American leaders wanted to try and increase the power of their nation. And the people like Alexander Hamilton said one of the best ways we can do that is by linking this new United States to financiers, to bankers, to powerful people who have money in Europe. And so that's what they did. And so again, that's one other reason why you see this shift in how Americans start to view economic equality. During the American Revolution, it was an ideal, it was an opportunity. By the time you get to the 1810s and 20s, it is something completely different.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really surprised me when I read your book, The Lost Tradition of Economic Equality in America, is that not only were these ideas of economic equality baked in to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in terms of the founding documents, but the thing that really surprised me was that there was a relatively small wealth gap before the revolution where, people as wealthy as as George Washington and people as poor as someone in the poorhouse. There was, of course, a gap in wealth, but not as big of a gap that would have that happened to emerge in the mid to late or in the early to mid 19th century. So I wonder if you could tell us what happened in the United States economy or to American ideas about the economy that saw this relatively close wealth gap, from the 17th and 18th centuries become into this wide wealth gap by the 1830s and 1840s.
Um, the rise of capital as a form of wealth, of course, played a fundamental role in that. The rise and the increasing importance of corporations, because Americans did not like taxes. There is this kind of irony that after the war ended, taxes actually went up on Americans compared to what they had been in the 1750s and 1760s. And so public services, particularly outside New England taxation was accepted, but outside New England it wasn't. Corporations had to played a growing role in getting bridges built, roads, and then later on canals, railroads, factories. But Americans feared corporations at the same time, and there was a lot of opposition initially, but they increasingly relied on corporations to get these things done. So wealth becomes increasingly concentrated as a result of capital and the result of corporations and other mechanisms which are created and increasingly significant in driving American development. At the same time, there is opposition. There is concern about this. As I said at the very beginning, there is this fear that an aristocracy of wealth would emerge and corrupt the republic. Americans at the end of the revolution, 1780s, 1790s, are very proud of their republic and this relative equality that you were referring to. But they see what's going on. They recognize that the increasing role of capital and the need for corporations could change that. There are various ideas proposed to deal with this perceived threat. Limits on the redistribution of wealth are proposed. Some propose confiscating excessive amounts of property at death. Thomas Paine proposed this actually in one of his lesser known works, Agrarian Justice, to confiscate certain amount of wealth at death and redistribute it in the form of a certain sum given to every man and woman when they reach 21 for the purposes of building their lives afterwards, and then also an old age pension plan as well. There were plans floated to create universal education programs. But again, that requires taxation. And all these ideas founded on the problem that there was no generally recognized and accepted system of taxation. This was completely foreign to Americans. It's really only later, late 19th century, Civil War, that you start to get income taxes forming. So one of the things that begins to happen is wealth becomes concentrated over the generations. In the 1780s, 1790s, Americans actually were aware of this possibility. And so at the end of the American Revolution, many states, in fact, every state that had primogeniture, that is, if you died without a will, all the property would go to the eldest son, which is the English tradition. All the states changed their laws by 1800, so that if you died without a will, the property would be divided either among all the sons or among all the children. They also eliminated intestate law,
Entail?
Thank you. Thank you. Laws of entail, which put restrictions on property across the generations. The idea being that one person would die having a large amount of property, and the children would divide this up. And so if one person managed to get a whole lot of property, i.e. land, they wouldn't be able to keep it across the generations. It wouldn't be like England, where you'd get these huge estates, as Jane Austen depicted in her novels, growing generation by generation. Um, and so that power, Americans believed, would not, that wealth would not, that concentrated wealth would not happen. But of course, the problem became, at the same time, that wealth was being generated by capital, not just by land. And so even those measures were not successful in preventing the accumulation of wealth over the generations.
Another point that I noticed in the lost tradition of economic equality in America is that during the 17th and 18th centuries, there seemed to be a really close connection between politics and economic equality, that one got their economic equality in some ways by political participation. But by the mid to late 19th centuries, economic equality really becomes divorced from politics. So I wonder if you could tell us how economic equality became divorced from politics and what the ramifications were with this divorce.
I would argue that it did not become divorced from politics.
Oh, interesting.
Because it's, it's marginalized perhaps as a mainstream element in the debates among political parties. But it gets brought up over and over, and it pokes its head up during critical times in American history. The reason it becomes marginalized from political debates by 1810, perhaps, is that you had the rise, the shift to wage labor, the increasing property, the decline in property ownership as men are increasingly, particularly in the Northeast, are becoming wage laborers. And so problems develop in this question of whether those who lack property will be able to vote. As we started out talking at the beginning of this, the vote was always in English tradition and in colonial American tradition connected to owning property. But as a growing number of American men no longer own property, this raises a fundamental issue. And one thing that does happen in 1810s and 1820s, there's a wave of revisions of state constitutions in which property, the requirement to own property to be able to vote and hold office gets removed from those constitutions. And so in that sense, it does get stripped from politics because you don't need to own property to be able to vote. But at the same time, if you think of politics more broadly in terms of debates over laws and policies, it's very much part of the political arena. In the 1820s, 1830s, you have the rise of working men's parties who urge laws that will ensure that corporations play less of a role and that property, that wealth is more fairly divided. In the 1840s, you have the rise of former working men creating the National Reform Association with the slogan, "Vote yourself a farm," right? Pulling together the communitarian movements, which seemed perhaps distanced from politics, but many of them are closely connected to political people who are active in politics. Connecting those folks with labor organizations in a movement urging, among other things, that all the federal lands be divided fairly equally and only among people who go out and create farms, that you had to be an actual settler, an actual farmer to claim a maximum of 160 acres, which of course, 1862, becomes the Homestead Act, except the Homestead Act, as actually enacted by the Republican Congress during the Civil War, did not put that limit on land ownership. They did say, okay, you can claim up to 160 acres for only a small filing fee, so essentially it was free. But the National Reform Association and this larger ideal said, no, there needs to be a limit on the amount of land that any individual could own. So egalitarian economics and the idea of property ownership being widespread and the danger of concentrated wealth is very much part of politics. It's just not necessarily part of the debate among political leaders, among political parties.
Now, Dan, I know we could go on and talk about this all night long, but I do have one last question for you before we turn this over into audience question and answer session. And that is, we've talked about James Harrington, we've talked about John Locke and John Adams, we've talked about the Working Men's Party. Does economic equality not include women in early America?
Yeah. Good question. And because it is a fundamentally political idea, even when property holding is stripped from participation in politics, women are still explicitly denied a voice in politics. The same wave of Constitution writing, the 1810s and 1820s, took away in New Jersey the right of women property owners to vote. And the constitutions all said you need to be free, white, male, and 21 to be able to vote. And you don't have to own property. And that becomes the new norm. It's really beginning to see some stirrings, I would say, perhaps in the 1830s, 40s, as women begin to play more of a prominent role in the labor market. There's issues of divorce, there's all kinds of issues. So you start to get some rumbling that wives and unmarried women perhaps should be able to have property and play a role, but it's clearly not part of the mainstream of thought at this point.
So what do you think, audience? It's now time for the Q&A, and we'd love to hear your questions about economic equality.
Great. Thank you both for a fabulous conversation. And I see that we have a couple questions that were typed in. William typed in, it seems as though the New England Puritans would have been quite open to economic equality. How were those ideals considered by that group?
Among Puritans, they did. They believed in hierarchy, a social hierarchy, a godly hierarchy. They came over with this, and in fact, one of the most famous New England Puritan statements at the beginning of Massachusetts settlement, John Winthrop's sermon, sometimes referred to as the City Upon a Hill sermon, stated explicitly, look, we're creating a godly commonwealth here. If you're expecting to come over to make money and as an individual get ahead, forget it. That's not what we're doing here. And when there was one wealthy merchant, Robert Keynes, who overcharged a little too much, and I don't remember all the details, he was taken down a few pegs and had to apologize for misbehaving publicly, apologize to the entire community. It was not uncommon in England at this time to put limits on prices for necessities like bread, beer, tavern fees, if you're staying the night, stable fees, ferry fees, things like that. And most of the colonies, including New England, did continue to put these sorts of measures into place. they were breached perhaps often, but everyone knew that they could be reimposed if necessary.
Okay. So Jerry has raised his hand, so I'm going to allow him to talk. So Jerry, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
You had commented on the rise of capitalism in the early part of the 19th century as leading to inequality. And I was wondering if you could comment on the role of technology, because I think that, which I think is also relevant today, technology enables the capitalists to both control production and frankly control people without using people. And I think to some extent, steam power in those days and a lot of technology things today give rise to inequality.
So the question is, to what extent does technology play a role in this growing inequality and the decline of this tradition?
I think that was it, and I've actually unmuted Jerry. So
okay. I don't think technology necessarily does that. For one thing, wage labor, non-permanent wage labor, people who would work for during the seasons, for example, that was not dependent on technology. There's a great book by Sean Wellens, Chance Democratic, that goes into how even before there were factories, there were sweatshops in New York City. Same thing was true in Philadelphia, where workers would, unskilled or semi-skilled labor, assembling garments, doing similar things, and that was not dependent on any kind of technological change. That was simply a matter of organization of labor. So the organization of labor that tended to create a growing community of people without property and growing gap between rich and poor happened before the shift to factories and that kind of thing. There is no doubt, however, that when you start having to pay for the machines to create factories, that dictates certain labor systems that exacerbates that situation. So it's a factor, but it's not the only one.
There's also a question, do you see indentured servitude as a means of social mobility or as a mechanism of class oppression?
Indentured servitude is it could be either. It could be either. It could be both. Why not? It certainly seems to fit. Indentured servants coming over to, say, Eastern Pennsylvania in the late 18th, early 19th century, its opportunity to get land. You could say the same thing about indentured servants coming over to Virginia in the early mid 17th century. There's a high death rate. There's all kinds of problems and issues that they face. It's a form of class oppression, but it's also an opportunity to get land. While these different societies are still and economies are still very much in development in flux. So it's both.
So Nina, I may have mispronounced that, has asked a question, and you're welcome to talk if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yes, oh good, I am talking. I did ask a question, but actually I would prefer to piggyback on Liz's question that she asked at the end around the history of the property requirement for the vote being removed. And I know that here in New England, by 1840, in New England, all of the states that had allowed free blacks to vote had explicitly denied the vote to free blacks, at least. And so I'm wondering if you could kind of comment on how tied to the removal of property requirements for the vote is to the explicit removal of suffrage, particularly for free blacks.
It's clearly connected. And the nationally, it is accurate to say that the period of the first half of the 19th century is the emergence of a white man's republic, because the vote gets, the need to own property gets stripped from the right to vote, and instead the right to vote gets explicitly linked to being white, male, and 21.
Okay, great. There was a question typed in that said, how does the relatively early introduction of slavery into the English colonies qualify a story of economic equality and its enormous scale by the time of the Civil War?
Yeah. It is an ideal. The ideal of economic equality, it is connected to these concepts of republicanism. It can, in fact, exist simultaneously with slavery, unfortunately, and it does. That is not to say that people at the time didn't recognize this as an issue, and they did. Edmund Morgan wrote that amazing book, American Slavery, American Freedom, which points out that it seems like a paradox, but it actually makes an unfortunate sense. It is also true at the same time that it becomes apparent by the time of the American Revolution that slavery is a system that is oppressive, that creates inequalities. It is actually one of the reasons why New England, some of the New England states were concerned about joining the Constitution, because the Constitution did not end slavery. And one of some of the fears expressed by some of the state leaders in some of the New England states was that joining this Constitution, this system of the Union, would result in slave-owning states gaining more power and gaining more wealth and subverting the egalitarian ideals embedded in New England culture.
Liz, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to any of the questions that have been asked, or if you had any reflections on any of these.
You know, I was just struck by Dan's answers, as well as, you know, information in his book about how there always has to seem to be like an inequality to have some measure of people to have equality. And I don't really have an answer, but I've been chewing on this for days, because it really does seem like you can't have any form of equality unless someone, you know, has some form of inequality.
Yeah, and that's a good issue, good thing to think about. I tend to be a glasses half full person, an optimist, and I see points when the ideal is reasserted in places and times where slavery is pretty much over and gone. In northeastern cities and villages in the 1830s and 40s, where it goes along with ideals of other forms of social reform. And so I would hope that it's not necessary, right? I think that it is an ideal that you can never have absolute economic equality. I mean, even the people during the Revolution and in the early Republic who argued that we had to beware excessive wealth because that would corrupt the United States. They would not say, oh, all property has to be evenly distributed. The point was, you don't want extremes, that extremes are what endanger a democratic republic. And I think that that is an ideal that we need to remember. And we need to, we don't have to have inequality. We don't have to have slavery. We don't have to have oppression to remember that. and to keep that in our in our debates as something that is an ideal for our nation to try to live up to, because otherwise we wind up with the situation we have today. We've forgotten that ideal.
Well, Mimi has raised her hand, so I'm going to allow Mimi to talk. Did you have a question, Mimi?
Yes, I do. Thanks, Galvin. I have a question because we are an immigrant country. You know, we have different waves of immigrations, right? So the concept economic equality rolls out a different period, has different meanings. So of course you can go like, you know, the Irish, you know, Mediterranean, and not today Hispanic or Chinese, different waves. So different waves, this concept becomes different. So can you tell us a little bit more how this immigration affects or metamorphoses the idea of economic equality to, I mean, today, the present moment as well? It also plays a role.
Right. No, absolutely. Culture never stands still. Right? Culture is always evolving, just like societies and people. And immigration clearly shapes this ideal. We talked already about the role that English immigrants, Irish and Scottish immigrants played into the 19th century in shaping this. My own ancestors, my grandparents, right? They came over from Eastern Europe, and they brought with them some of the socialist ideals that they had learned over there in Ukraine, in Russia. And they added those to the existing ideas of American democracy, American republicanism. At the same time, it fits, right? It's not, I mean, socialism existed before my grandparents showed up. They brought, they added to older ideas of equality, some new variations on that. But there is still this kind of fundamental core, I think, that carries through.
So there was a question typed in that says, I'm wondering if you found certain Protestant groups who held on longer to the ideal of economic equality in the antebellum period, and those that did not. I'm struck that the conservative evangelical movement today actually promotes accumulation of wealth and the concentration of power in the hands of the wealthy, while secular progressive people would like to redistribute wealth.
Interesting, I would say that radical evangelicals during the Great Awakening, because they thought in almost absolute egalitarian terms, many of them. There's work done by Doug Winiarski, his marvelous book recently published, delves into some of that, kind of highlights the radical egalitarianism of evangelicals during the 1740s, the 1750s. And I think that continues during the revolution. You see radical evangelical Protestants. I'm thinking actually of the hill, people living in the hills, Baptists, who then later on will form some of the backbone of what becomes the Shakers, right? They bring to the table some pretty radical ideas about the economy and economic justice. So that is something that is certainly a thread that runs into the early republic, up through, let's say, almost to the Civil War.
So there's two people with their hands raised, and I think that those will probably be the last two questions. So Susan, you should be able to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question.
Actually, it's my husband, Ed, who has the question.
You mentioned the effect of 1800s where the corporations became a more powerful force. And I'm interested in how we got from there to Citizens United, where suddenly they became persons.
Yeah. When corporations were created, and going back to earliest times, they had this interesting existence. Lawyers would tell you they were people, fictional people, right? And the entities existed outside, the corporate entities existed outside of legally outside of the people who own stock in the corporation. That was kind of the fundamental start. But things evolved, and I would say that what we're looking at, Citizens United and frankly also the Hobby Lobby case is similar, have taken some of these earlier ideas about corporations being fictional people and created this gigantic edifice where it seems that corporations to some extent today have more power and more rights than individuals do, right? Because Hobby Lobby is a corporation, and the Supreme Court in its decision said, oh, corporations can have religious beliefs, and they can institute rules that dictate to the people who work in the corporations that may not share the same beliefs, what those individuals can and cannot do. Similarly, the idea that corporations, actually, it's not just Citizens United, it's something but related to the same thing. The idea that money is speech, political speech, to be protected, and that corporations can use money in political speech. Frankly, the founders would have been horrified at this. That's almost the very definition of wealth, of corrupting wealth, corrupting concentrated wealth, because the more money, the louder the speech. That is the explicit, that is the result. And so I really think that what we see today would have horrified the founders and people who were creating corporations and involved in corporations 1780s, 1790s. That was the farthest thing from their minds.
So one last question. This is Elizabeth.
Just want you to talk just a little bit about how these different notions of equality play against each other, so for example, Canadians tend to believe that you need an equality of circumstance, where Americans tend to believe you need an equality of opportunity. And so there is this, you have political equality, you have access to the vote. So how much are these other expressions of equality used to mask growing inequality, and how much in the United States the challenge against the vote is really exacerbating anxieties about wealth distributions?
Let me answer the first part of the question first, then let me ask you to clarify the second part. These different forms of equality are very, very important. Certainly in the 17th and 18th century in America, in the Anglo-American colonies in early United States, you had both equality of opportunity and equality of, what was the other term you used?
Circumstance.
Yes, both equality of circumstance, because property was widespread since they'd taken it from Native Americans, and they had equality of opportunity because there were all kinds of opportunities to get ahead, or not to get ahead, but to create a business and pass it on to your sons. But that began to change. And one of the things that happened during the American Revolution and the early Republic was this increasingly significant liberal ideal that individuals should have the right to own their own property free of community interference, free of government control. And that's when you begin to see debates over this question of equality of circumstances versus equality of opportunity. The push for universal education emphasized opportunity. And so that becomes increasingly significant. It doesn't completely push out equality of circumstances, as we'll see in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s with these other movements that I've pointed to. But clearly, liberal individualism and the control of property goes along with dominance of the idea of equality of opportunity. Now, you asked the question also about the vote.
Well, so when you get universal manhood suffrage in the 1830s, you don't have to have any property. So some people have argued that the vote is compensation for lack of wealth, that you have another kind of equality. In exchange for economic inequality, you have the equality of having the right to political participation.
Right.
And it seems to me that one of the things that's happening with the issues around the vote and political speech right now in the United States is that there is a concern that even those gestures of equality are disappearing.
Yes. Yes, that certainly is a concern. And going back to the deal that you spoke of, I call that kind of the dark side of this universal white male manhood suffrage. We know it's widely known that what went along with that was race and gender restrictions, but normally that's still celebrated because more people could vote in raw numbers after these constitutions were changed. But what went along with it also was this deal that, oh, now the property is no longer closely connected to having a political voice. It's no longer that important whether property is widely held or not, because men can vote regardless. White men can vote regardless. Today, I think this is one of the reasons why we are so concerned in part about the vote, because the vote was the one remaining element, if you will, of this deal. I think that there is also unease about rising economic inequality at the same time. That's one reason why I wrote the book, and I think that is something that goes along with the issues of voting as well. And the idea that one could buy political speech, I think that it's causing a lot of grief as well in the United States.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Mandel, and thank you very much, Liz Covart. It was a wonderful conversation, and I encourage everyone to buy the book as well as to check out Liz's podcast, Ben Franklin's World. And thank you all for coming. That if you enjoyed this program and you would like to purchase a copy of the book, you can copy it with a 30% discount from Johns Hopkins Press. And also, if you have enjoyed this program and you would like to consider supporting the Massachusetts Historical Society and our work, you can visit the website masshist.org/support to show your support.